Lesson 9.4, Completing the Square. Today we're going to learn a new tactic for factoring and solving quadratic equations. And this tactic or this strategy is called completing the square. Before I teach you how to solve by completing the square, let's recall what we learned in lesson 8.6, and that is how to factor a perfect square trinomial. Let's recall what a perfect square trinomial looks like. In a perfect square trinomial, your first term is a perfect square. The middle term is twice the product of the square roots of the first and the last terms, and your last term is a perfect square. Let's also recall the pattern that we learned in factoring a perfect square trinomial. We know this would be A, either plus or minus B, depending on the sign here, squared. We will be forcing equations into perfect square trinomials by completing the square. So, any quadratic in the form x squared plus bx can be made into a perfect square trinomial using this method called completing the square. There are 3 steps you will need to follow. First of all, if you have an equation x squared plus bx, you will find 1/2 of b. Then you square the result and then add the result to your x squared plus bx, and you will find that you have a perfect square trinomial. Okay, let's practice this skill. Find the value of c that makes the equation a perfect square trinomial. Let's go over the 3 steps. First, find 1/2 of b. So b equals 4 in this case. So let's take 4 and divide it by 2. My result is 2. Okay, so step number 2, it says square the result. 2 squared is 4, and now that's the result that we're going to add to our equation and fill in for c. So here's my perfect square trinomial. X squared plus 4x plus 4. Okay, and just to practice factoring, take the square root of the first term, square root of the second term. We'll take the sign of the middle term, and it's squared. X plus 2 squared. Okay? All right. Sorry about that. Number 2. Let's try number 2. R squared minus 8r plus c. So my first step says to take b and find half of it. So b in this case is -8. So we'll take -8 and divide it by 2, and the result is -4. Second step says now square the result. So we'll have to do -4 squared. Well, that's going to be positive 16, and positive 16 is the number I'm going to add and plug in for c. So here's my perfect square trinomial. 8 squared minus 8r plus 16. And once again, in order to go ahead and factor this perfect square trinomial, I follow the pattern. Take the square root of the first term, that's r. Take the square root of the second term, that's 4. And then I'll take the sign of my middle term, and that's a subtraction sign or a negative sign, and it's r minus 4 squared. Okay, try number 3 on your own. Pause the video and come back and check your answer. Okay, so the C equals 36, positive 36. And if I were to factor my perfect square trinomial, I would get x minus 6 squared. Okay, so now we're going to use completing the square to solve an equation. So write down number 4, please. X squared minus 6x plus 12 equals 19. The first thing that I need to do is I need to get my equation to be in the form x squared plus or minus bx. So in other words, I'll need to remove the positive 12. So let's subtract 12 from both sides for one moment. And so I get x squared minus 6x is equal to 7. Notice that I need to now find the number necessary to force a perfect square trinomial here. So let's follow the 3 steps that we previously learned. In this case, b is equal to negative 6. So let's take negative 6 divided by 2. We have negative 3. Let's take negative 3 and square it. And so I need to add 9 to make this into a perfect square trinomial. So because this is an equation, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So we're going to add 9 to both sides of this equation. Now, on the left side of this equation, notice that we now have a perfect square trinomial. This is a perfect square trinomial that can easily be factored. So if I follow the pattern, I can factor this perfect square trinomial, and it would be the square root of the first term is x, the square root of the second term is 3, and there is a subtraction because the sign for the middle term is negative, and it's x minus 3 squared equals 16. Now, in order to solve an equation where you have a term squared, we will find the square root of each side. And so we have x minus 3 is equal to positive negative 4. Okay, and then we will complete this problem looking at both scenarios. X minus 3 equals 4. X minus 3 equals negative 4. So in this case, if I add 3 to both sides, x equals 7. And in this case, if I add 3 to both sides, x equals negative 1. So my solutions are negative 1 and positive 7. Okay, remember that this is not an ordered pair. These are the 2 solutions to this quadratic equation. So we will not place them in parentheses. Okay? All right, let's go on to number 5. Number 5. X squared minus 12x plus 3 is equal to 8. So my first step is to remove that positive 3 so that then I can complete the square. So let's do that first. We're going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I have x squared minus 12x is equal to 5. Okay? Now I need to figure out what is the number that will complete the perfect square trinomial. So I take b, which is negative 12, divide that by 2, I get negative 6. Then I take negative 6 and I square it, and my answer would be 36. So I need to add 36 to both sides of my equation. So let's add 36, and whatever I do to one side, I'm going to do to the other. And let's bring down our equation. X squared minus 12x plus 36 is equal to 41. So now I'm ready to factor my perfect square trinomial using the pattern that I've learned. I know that this is going to be a squared binomial. The first term is my first term, the square root of x squared, which is x. And the second term is going to be the square root of 36, which is 6. And this is a minus situation because b is negative. So x minus 6 squared is equal to 41. Now let's find the square root of both sides. And so we have x minus 6 is equal to 6, positive and negative 6.4. You'll use your calculator to find the square root of 41 and round to the 10th place. So here are my two scenarios. X minus 6 is equal to 6.4. X minus 6 is equal to negative 6.4, and I will solve each one individually. So x minus 6 equals 6.4. As I add 6 to both sides, x equals 12.4. And then if I have negative 6.4 and I add 6 to both sides, I have negative 0.4. So my two solutions for this equation are negative 0.4 and 12.4. Okay, number 6. Negative 2x squared plus 8x minus 18 is equal to 0. Now, on this equation, there are a few things I need to do to get it into the desired form. Remember that in order to use completing the square, I need for my equation to have this form, x squared plus or minus bx. Okay, so there's a few things that I need to do on this equation. The first thing I need to do is get rid of the negative 2 coefficient on x. In order to get rid of that negative 2 coefficient, I'll have to divide both sides by negative 2 and rewrite the equation. So, negative 2x squared divided by negative 2 would be x squared. Positive 8x divided by negative 2 would be negative 4x. And then negative 18 divided by negative 2 would give us positive 9. And then 0 divided by negative 2 is 0. Okay, so now my next step is to put this into the right form. I need to subtract 9 from both sides. So let's do that. X squared minus 4x is equal to negative 9. Okay, now I need to find what number would complete the square, what number would make my equation into a perfect square trinomial. So let's go through that process. B is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Let's take negative 2 and square it, and that would give us 4. So I would need to add 4 to both sides of this equation. And I'm left with x squared minus 4x plus 4 is equal to negative 5. Let's go ahead and factor this perfect square trinomial using our pattern. And we know this is x minus 2 squared equals negative 5. if you try to find the square root of both sides of this equation, you would understand that this equation has no solution. -5 does not have a real number that is its square root because it's a negative number. So the answer here would be no real solution. Okay, number 7. 3x squared minus 9x minus 3 equals 21. Okay, again, we need a certain form to work with the completing the square method. That form is x squared plus or minus bx. So my first step is going to be to get rid of the positive 3 coefficient that x squared has, because it needs to have a coefficient of 1. So in order to do that, I need to divide both sides of my equation by 3. Okay, so here we go. X squared minus 3x minus 1 is equal to 7. All right, now I need to get rid of that -1, so let's add 1 to both sides. It's x squared minus 3x is equal to 8. And now I need to complete the square. So as you practice completing the square, you'll get better and better at it, and you may be able to do quite a bit of it in your head. But for the sake of documenting the process, I'll write it again. Okay, so identify b. b in this case is -3. Let's divide that by 2. That's -3/2. Now let's take the result, -3/2, and let's square it, and we have positive 9/4. It would be 9/4 if you used fractions. If you went to a decimal, it's 1.5, -1.5 squared, which in turn would be 2.25. Either one works. We'll do the decimal in this case. So we need to add 2.25 to both sides of this equation in order to make it into a perfect square trinomial. All right, so here we go. We have x squared minus 3x plus 2.25 is equal to 10.25. All right, so now I can use my pattern to factor my perfect square trinomial, and I have x minus 1.5 squared is equal to, and now I need to find, no, I'm sorry, I don't. I need to just bring that down. Okay? Now I need to find the square root of both sides. Again, in order to find the square root of 10.25, you will use your calculator, and you will then round to the nearest tenths. So x minus 1.5 equals positive and negative 3.2. So let's solve for each scenario. X minus 1.5 equals positive 3.2, and I have x minus 1.5 might equal negative 3.2. So here I add 1.5 to both sides, and I get x equals 4.7. And here, as I add 1.5 to both sides, x equals negative 1.7. So my solution is solutions are negative 1.7 and 4.7. Okay. Number 8, I'd like you to try on your own. So pause the video now, work on number 8, come back and check your work. Okay, first step is going to be to get rid of that -2 coefficient. so that we could have the right form to use the completing the square method. So we will divide by -2 on both sides of our equation. So here we go. X squared minus 18x plus 5 is equal to -12. Now let's subtract 5 from both sides. X squared minus 18x is equal to -17. In order to complete the square, I'll take b, which is -18. I'll divide that by 2 and I'll get -9. Then I'll take -9 and square it, and that equals 81. So to complete the square, I need to add 81 to both sides. So let's do that. Let's add 81 to both sides of this equation. Okay, so I get, whoops, sorry about that. I get x squared minus 18x plus 81 is equal to positive 64. Let's use the pattern to factor that perfect square trinomial, and I know it's x minus 9 squared is equal to 64. Now let's find the radical of both sides of this equation, and I get x minus 9 is equal to positive -8. So my two scenarios are x minus 9 equals 8, x minus 9 equals -8. So in this case, if I add 9 to both sides, x is equal to 17. In this case, as I add 9 to both sides, x equals 1. So my solutions are 1 and 17. Extra practice for tonight. These three exercises, 2, 6, and 10, all I want you to do is find the value of c that will make each trinomial a perfect square. And then you will do 3 more exercises where you will actually solve the equation by completing the square. Again, round to the nearest tenth if necessary when you're finding the square root. Okay, remember to jot down your questions. Be ready for discussion tomorrow. God bless you. Have a great night.